Baldur's Gate 3 has taken many by surprise, for a variety of reasons. A large chunk of the population had in fact no idea about the game until fairly recently, just prior to its release, and its popularity is surprising to many of us, at least to the degree it has been popular. Die-hard RPG fans would have gotten the game regardless, but what is truly surprising is the draw the game has had for people who typically have zero interest in most RPGs. I could list off a few classic and newer RPGs, and a good deal of the current players playing Baldur's Gate 3 will have never heard of them. Neverwinter Nights, Dragon Age Origins, Pillars of Eternity, Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, Kingmaker, and Tyranny, to name a few. There are even those who are playing Baldur's Gate 3 that cannot stomach Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and usually these are younger people because of how dated these games seem by comparison. Now, for some reason, and we need to be honest, Baldur's Gate 3 has become a runaway hit, and the degree of just how much of a hit it is fairly baffling. We all knew it would do well, but this well? Consider Sven Vinke's expectations himself of some 100,000 plus people playing around launch, not close to 900,000. The fan scores and the Metacritic scores have broken records, and we still, at the end of the day, do not know exactly why, and ultimately what accounts for the insane success we have borne witness to. We could spend a lot of time speculating, and it's always fun, and there are many indications that point to the reasons. The combat is super fun and engaging, the reactivity is great, and the whole game just has a very D&D feel to it. But many players of Baldur's Gate don't give a whit about D&D and have no interest in D&D. To offer a counterexample to one point, in my own view, Baldur's Gate 3 does nothing perfectly, but does many, many things very well. And this woven together creates an outstanding game. But that's just my take. I think we cannot deny that the massive media coverage preceding launch, even on short notice, and then immediately following release, put this game on the radar of people who would have otherwise never played it, let alone heard of it. And this ties into the question we ultimately seek to answer here. We've already discussed at length whether or not Baldur's Gate 3 is an anomaly, and in some sense, it sort of is. With the well-known passion and devotion to their craft and unique circumstances, it kind of is an anomaly. But what several people have recently put forth as a thesis is that Baldur's Gate 3 is not just an amazing game, and one that will be remembered for years to come, but also a game that has now begun a revolution in RPGs. And it is an interesting question, because as great as Baldur's Gate 3 is, we always look onward to the future to see if anything of promise might lie there concerning RPGs. So, will Baldur's Gate 3 have such a massive impact that it will lead to a renaissance, or even a revolution, of RPGs? It's funny to think about, but we actually did experience a kind of CRPG renaissance not all too long ago, in the mid to late 2010s, as well as the early 2020s. Games such as the Pillars of Eternity series, Tyranny, Divinity series, and Pathfinder were all parts of this renaissance, and all in many ways spiritual successors to the CRPGs of old. Within CRPG circles, all of these games garnered great interest, if not acclaim, for their contributions to the genre. But as we can see, there have been more than one really good CRPGs that have been put out in the last 10 years, and as saddening as it is to admit, none of them have led to any revolution or even a mild renaissance. Instead, these games appeal to the same people they have always appealed to. Nerdy, geeky people, like myself, who like numbers and the CRPG genre. The reality of RPGs is that one RPG is not necessarily the same as another. Quite the opposite, in fact. Of the games I mentioned before, several are quite distinct from Baldur's Gate 3. Most specifically, in the realm of mechanics. Both Pillars of Eternity and Pathfinder systems are mechanically far more demanding in terms of understanding their systems than is the 5th edition system of Baldur's Gate 3. And this has consequences. Story-wise, both Pillars of Eternity and both Pathfinder games could give Baldur's Gate 3 a run for its money, at least in some respects, and might even best Baldur's Gate 3 in others. But none of these games have had the mass appeal of Baldur's Gate 3. Some of this comes down to things such as marketing, scale, i.e. much smaller teams with much less money at their disposal. But the elephant in the room when it comes to CRPGs, and one of the reasons they have traditionally not been particularly popular, is their mechanically demanding nature. arguably a legacy effect of the oldest forms of D&D, with complex rules and endless minutiae of details concerning said rules, which is best typified in 1st and 2nd edition D&D. Well, 5th edition rules are the polar opposite, and were intended to be as accessible as possible, to as broad an audience as possible, whence undoubtedly its unparalleled popularity stems. Never before had D&D been as popular as with 5th edition, and in no small way, this transferred over very well to Baldur's Gate 3. Beyond the marketing, the hype, the scale in terms of team members, work and budget, Baldur's Gate 3 is uniquely accessible with respect to its mechanics. In fact, you don't even need to understand the mechanics of 5th edition to enjoy the game. And I know of tons of people who don't have the slightest clue about D&D 5th edition mechanics, or D&D more broadly, and they enjoy and even love Baldur's Gate 3. And therefore, you could make an argument that mechanics are one of the least important aspects of the game overall. There are plenty of people out there that would enjoy the stories in CRPGs such as Wrath of the Righteous, Tyranny, or Pillars of Eternity, but the mechanical barrier to entry is fairly high. Even though technically, all of these games offer an equivalent of a story mode, mechanics still loom large, as if you have ever had a look at a Pathfinder game's character sheet and level up screen, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. But perhaps even more important than the mechanical differences that typically exist between the aforementioned games and Baldur's Gate 3, there's another aspect to it. And this one might even be the most obvious. It is difficult to wholly ignore the fact of scale when talking about Baldur's Gate 3 and its impact on the future of CRPGs, and whether or not it has begun a revolution, because the scale of it did allow it to do things that many RPGs can only dream of. But much of this scale, I need to point out, was directed towards doing one thing in particular, creating a large and expansive cinematic narrative experience. And this, above all, serves to distinguish Baldur's Gate 3 from so many other CRPGs, and makes it far more similar to the type of RPGs that the late BioWare used to create. And this type of RPG, put simply, has far greater and wide-reaching appeal than what we conventionally understand to be CRPGs. This cinematic narrative element is likely the primary reason why Baldur's Gate 3 has such a broad and large player base. After all, there are literally people whose sole reason to play this game is simply to play it as a romance sim for the sake of a certain vampire spawn, and don't even care about the story, much less the mechanics of the game. And the scale of the game, particularly with respect to narrative, allows such players to enjoy a CRPG that they otherwise would not have played, all the while allowing other players who enjoy spells and builds, or the larger story, to enjoy what they like about the game. Most humans simply respond better to cinematic narratives than balls of text, no matter how well written they might be, and few to no other CRPGs to date have achieved this, at least not to the same degree. Only the games of the late BioWare had produced in the days of yore have done this to any extent. The reality is there is no one CRPG, much less RPG in the broader sense of the genre. The Witcher 3 is widely hailed as one of the great RPGs of our time, but it almost fits the category of action RPG, especially if compared to Baldur's Gate 3. It actually has limited dialogue choice, and you play a single pre-established character, but remains a great game. The confluence of factors that has led to Baldur's Gate 3's resounding success has in fact less to do with its status as a CRPG, and much more to do with striking a balance between many different aspects of the RPG genre, all the while remaining accessible. It is a reasonably technical game, but not overwhelmingly so, such as Pathfinder games. And therefore, even if you don't care about or understand the mechanics of the game, it can still be very enjoyable. Baldur's Gate 3 also offers enough cinematic narrative experiences beyond conventional CRPGs that it casts a far wider net, hence why it can non-jokingly be referred to as a romance sim, and played as such by the lovers of Astarion. And finally, there are just so many things you can do, from being a simple murder hobo, to throwing halfling party members at enemies, to biting off the toes of goblins, that there is basically something for everyone. It is an anomaly, a game that does many things very well, albeit not perfectly, which then allows for an incredibly broad audience and player base to appreciate it. Traditional CRPGs have never done this, and probably not just for budgetary constraint reasons, as they typically have a much more narrow scope, and as a consequence, end up having a much more narrow audience. All of this in summation suggests that rather than kicking off a revolution in CRPGs, or more broadly, RPGs, Baldur's Gate 3 has kicked off a revolution for itself, and perhaps for Larian Studios. For example, I am confident that whatever the next Pathfinder game is by Owlcat, whatever the rule set, most likely Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it will be wildly popular in niche circles. Just as I should mention, Owlcat's Warhammer 40k game will be wildly popular in niche circles, rather than attracting the broadest audience possible. What is really meant by an RPG revolution is actually a Baldur's Gate 3 revolution, precisely for all the reasons cited. It does a lot of things very well, and offers something for almost everyone, and the prerequisite for a revolution of the genre to follow it would be to follow its model, almost to a T, something most games will not do, and therefore it has not been and will not be a catalyst for a new revolution in RPGs. However, this notwithstanding, I do believe that it has whetted the appetite for the CRPG genre of many people for whom this genre had formerly been inaccessible and obscure, and may lead to a rise in popularity of the CRPG as a whole. But revolutionary it will not be. And ultimately, this doesn't take away from the game of Baldur's Gate 3 at all. Whether it is its own revolution or begins other revolutions, it's just that Baldur's Gate 3 is very much a self-contained unit, largely inimitable for a variety of reasons. Whilst having an impact on the genre and may inspire other games, the CRPG genre as a whole will probably remain niche for the foreseeable future. And there's nothing wrong with that. Comparing different games even seems silly at times. What I enjoy about Pathfinder games, for example, is not the same thing I enjoy about Baldur's Gate 3, and vice versa. And most people can enjoy them on their own terms, whatever their differences. And the core player base of RPGs will likely do the same. No revolutions needed. Thanks for tuning in. Before I go, I'd like to invite you to my Discord server, where you can discuss Baldur's Gate 3 with like-minded people, as well as other RPGs. And if you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel, and hit the bell icon to be notified of my videos. It'd be much appreciated, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.